in 2016 that people started to really talk about empathy. And that was on the back of a speech that President Obama had given even more years ago before that, so in 2006. And in 2006, Obama stood up and he addressed the audience and he said, everyone is talking about our federal deficit, but I think we should be talking about our empathy deficit. And as you can see, that was 15 years ago, and still nothing really changed. So the conversation began to grow in recent years. But I like to tell a story of my own mum, actually, back in November, which kind of proves how little people have been talking about empathy. I've just written a book about empathy and about how we can use that in the workplace. And my mum said to me back in November, but darling, why does anybody want to read about empathy? You know, who leap of faith, mum. But I believe, and this was in November, that 2020 is going to be the year when empathy goes mainstream. That we've just got too many problems in the world and we've had such high amounts of stress for so long that this awareness around empathy is going to change, and 2020 is going to be the year. Now, of course, I didn't know, none of us did, that COVID-19 would hit and that 2020 would be a very, very different year. Now, whilst nobody wants to find an opportunity in a crisis or in a terribly distressing time, what has happened in this period is that awareness for empathy, for mutual connectivity, for cohesion between people has definitely gone up. And without a doubt, if you start to look for it, you will see that empathy, the word empathy, is all around us now. What is empathy, and what are some of the signs of when we're using or don't have enough empathy? So at its core, empathy is about perspective taking. It's about understanding other people. It's about standing in their shoes. Empathy can be a very analytical skill. It allows you to understand the context of someone else. So people often ask me, what's the difference between empathy and sympathy? Empathy is something that brings people together. It allows you to connect. It allows you to share a reality, to understand what someone else is going through. Whereas sympathy actually disconnects people. It creates distance. Because when you hear of a sad story or some bad news that someone else is going through, you feel pity. But that's not something that brings you closer together. It's a feeling for them. Whereas empathy is an ability to stand and understand their reality with them. So there is quite a big difference. My passion is, the majority of the time, I work with organizations and with business people to talk about empathy in culture, because I believe that not enough businesses understand the power of empathy in organizations, because fundamentally, when people are happy, they do better work, they perform better, we see output going up. So it really is a very active and output-driven piece of cultural leadership, which is where I spend a lot of my time working on that. Empathy has been in decline for 3 decades. So from far before that Barack Obama quote back in 2006, we've seen 3 decades of empathy declining, and the impact of that is across society. And I want to tell you just 2 really small stories about how I discovered empathy and why I became so passionate about it. So 2 things that I discovered in the last 2 years. One of them was that the largest killer of youth, so according to the World Health Organization, so this is big, serious data, the biggest killer from 15 to 27-year-olds, the second biggest killer, in fact, is suicide. So when you think about that, our youth are killing themselves rather than living what should be the best use of their life because of the world that they're living in. The highest killer, by the way, is car accidents. So behind car accidents, the biggest killer of our youth is suicide. And suicide rates are now actually the highest they have been since World War II. And that is associated with a whole lot of other mental health data out there. High levels of depression, anxiety, the highest ever levels we've seen of burnout. We have a loneliness endemic. Loneliness levels are through the roof. And of course, these come from a whole area of sort of facets that have got them there: globalization, urbanization, global travel, technology, longer working hours, stress in life. Stress is a huge impact on that. So when I saw that data around youth suicide, I really felt like it's time to do something to try and have more conversation around what's going on in our society. The second thing that I came across was a realization last summer. In fact, I have a little girl, she's now 3, and I realized that if I was living in the US around about now, so preschool, 3-4 years old, I would have to teach her how to stand on a loo seat in a bathroom as part of the training for what they should do when a gunman enters their school. So these tiny, tiny little children, 3-4 years old, who at this stage in their lives are just these wonderful, innocent little things that look up to us adults, are being taught that should a man or woman come into their school with the purpose of killing them, they must understand that they should stand on top of a loo seat so that that gun person can't see their feet in that loo stall. And again, when I heard that data, I just felt compelled to really ignite this conversation, because of course these things don't all come back to people or a person that doesn't have enough empathy, but it can be linked significantly to the decreasing levels of empathy in society, the disconnection between people, the lack of engagement and emotional connection between people that is creating these areas of distress in society and also in our businesses. In terms of my own sort of journey to this, so I've been studying empathy and the deficit for around about 2 years now. I've been in Dubai for a similar period of time. And those two stories intertwine for a reason. So when I got to the Middle East, and I think lots of us, when we arrived here, had to learn a lot about how business is done here and how things work in this region. I had come from nearly 14, 15 years of living around the world. I've lived in Hong Kong and Singapore and South Africa. I've worked in Nigeria and Indonesia and Malaysia and all around the world. So my focus for many years, over a decade, has been cultural understanding and people, understanding people. And what I learned was that underneath all the culture, underneath the norms and the things that perhaps slightly different in each market that make us who we are, our basic needs are all the same. Our need to feel safe, to be loved, to have friends, to feel secure, to grow, all of those things are exactly the same across the world, across markets. So when I got to this region and I took over a small business here, I found that many of the learnings that I could have experienced around the world, I could bring to here. And one of the biggest things missing was this idea of empathy, kindness, human decency in the workplace. And I took over a business that needed a lot of restructuring. I write about the story in my book. It needed a total overhaul from sort of the ground up. And we had to really turn around this business story. And when I arrived, I knew nobody. I had no network. I had no business here. I had no clients here. And the only thing I did know at that time was that if I put people at the forefront of every decision I made, whether those were my people in my team, we're about 30 people in, I don't think I mentioned, I run an advertising agency. So 30 people in this ad agency, or my clients, or my suppliers, my partners, whoever. If I put people first, if I really just focused on people above all else, I could turn that business around and grow that business. And indeed, I did. It worked. And 2 years on, we have a really great, thriving small business here in Dubai. And again, that was part of the reason I wanted to write my book, was to share how we did that and why we did that. So that tells you a little bit about my story and how I got here. As I said, I've now been studying this for around about 2 years. There is no shortage of data about empathy and emotional intelligence and how important these facets are in the world. And my goal is to talk about them more widely. Now, the great news is, as I said earlier, now that you've been here today with me, with Tash and the team, you'll see it everywhere. So Bloomberg, Huffington Post, the BBC, you'll see the word empathy is increasing. So that story about me and my mum back in November, it has come true, because actually 2 weeks ago, she called me And she said, if you remember, originally she asked me, but who's ever going to talk about empathy? 2 weeks ago, she called me and said, darling, I'm hearing about it so much, I'm getting a little bit bored. So thanks, Mum. But it's changing. And if my, let's say, elderly mother has heard about this in her sphere of reference, which is very far away from mine, very far away from the world of business and startups and all of that, there's definitely something going on. In fact, even Coca-Cola's recent marketing campaign in Europe was launched on what they called an empathy platform. And if you work in marketing or know anything about brands and marketing, you'll know that when Coca-Cola goes somewhere, everybody else follows. So if Coke have recently announced that their new marketing platform is all about empathy, we can be sure that give us another 6 or 12 months and we'll see this all over the place. So one of the things about empathy is that there is this common sort of misconception that you are either more or less empathetic, which may be true in some ways. You may be naturally more inclined to being a more or less empathetic person. But what's not true is that you are born being or not being. You can teach it, you can hone it, and you can practice it. And I talk about practicing very specifically. I use it in all the work I do and all the talks I give, because you can practice it and you can get better at it. One of the ways we can do that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this today, is through storytelling and through stories, songs, movies, content, all kinds of different areas. Because when you, for example, read a book and you read about a character, you find it much more easy to step into their shoes, right? To understand them, to imagine what they're seeing, how they're feeling, if they're heartbroken or they're in love or they're going on an adventure. You can feel it because you're reading through their eyes. You're able to stand in their shoes. So creativity is an amazing medium for doing this. You really can drive up empathy through the use of creativity, which we know is a skill both in life and in work that is increasingly talked about and desired, because creativity fuels us and it inspires us. So I want to tell you a little story now about a little girl named Dolly. And I'm going to tell you this story because I think that Dolly's story will allow me to exemplify for you how empathy allows us to see things differently and to see things that may have nothing to do with our own actual current reality. So Dolly is a little girl. She's about 6 years old, and she comes from a really poor, impoverished background. She lives in a very small house. She's an only child with her mum and dad. Her dad's a farmer, and they live on the outskirts of town. She goes to school every day and she walks quite a long way. So it's about a 45-minute walk that Polly walks every day and gets to school. Now, the school doesn't only have, has a mixed group of children there. So it's not all people from impoverished or rural or farming backgrounds. There are all kinds of people, children there from across society. And Polly can find it, Dolly, sorry, Polly, you think I'm talking to you. Dolly can find it a little bit difficult in her school because she doesn't have the things that all the other children do. She doesn't have all the kind of newest clothes and toys and all of those things. And in particular, she has issues with her shoes because she walks so far and they're constantly going into holes, and her parents really don't have much money to replace these shoes. One August, September time, her mum is in town and she's waiting for the bus, and she's on her way home, and she notices that next to the bus stop is a bag of cloth, of rags, of sort of pieces of fabric. And she realizes that this has been discarded and it's nobody's, and that she can take that home with her. So of course she's thrilled because she doesn't have a lot of means to make new clothes for Dolly or to look after her particularly well in the fashion and the style stakes, but also just to make sure that she has the clothes she needs as she grows. So Dolly's mum takes this bag home, and that weekend Dolly is thrilled, and her mum set about making a coat. And they make a coat because, as I said, it's sort of end of August, early September. The fall, the autumn is coming, and she's going to have to keep walking, and it's getting cooler. So they spend this weekend together, and Dolly is so proud. She feels a little bit like a bride does on her wedding day, right? She's having this item fitted to her, and when she finally puts it on, she just feels like a princess. And the coat is multicolored. In my mind, it's a little bit like a sari, like one of those beautiful Indian saris you see with all the colors on it. And this little girl feels like $1,000,000, right? And she can't wait for Monday to walk to school and to show all of her friends this beautiful new coat. So she does. She walks to school on the Monday morning, and she's kind of, her head's held high, and she's so proud, and she can't wait. And then she gets to school and she goes through the gates, and she looks like I do now. She's got a massive smile on her face. And the children just look at her, and there's this sort of eerie silence, and then they start to laugh. And Dolly doesn't understand, why would they be laughing? So she asks them, and they proceed, as children often do, can be very unkind, to tell her that they don't like her coat, and that her coat isn't cool, and that her mum didn't know what she was doing, and this multicolored coat is totally not on trend. And Dolly tries to explain to them, but my mum made this coat for me, and it's beautiful, and I feel fantastic in it, and she put all of her love into making this coat for me. But children being children, they laugh at her, and poor old Dolly goes and sits on a bench on her own and feels thoroughly confused, actually, as a 6-year-old would, as to why she feels so fantastic that everybody else is laughing at her. And I want to read to you now just a little bit from Dolly's point of view. So the first person version of this story, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So this is how Dolly described that story. So I'm going to read now, so excuse me not looking straight at the camera. Back through the years, I go wandering again, back to the seasons of my youth, and I recall a box of rags that someone gave us, and how my mama put those rags to use. There were rags of many colours, every piece was small, and I didn't have a coat, and it was way down nearly full. So mama sewed those rags together, sewing every piece with love, and she made me a coat of many colours that I was so proud of. And as she sewed, she told me a story of a book that she had read about a coat of many colours that someone wore, and then she said, perhaps this coat will also bring you good luck and happiness. And I just couldn't wait to wear it, and my mama blessed it with a kiss. My coat of many colours that my mama made for me, made only from rags, but I wore it so proudly. And although we had no money, I felt as rich as I could be in this coat of many colours that my mother had made for me. So with patches on my breeches and holes in both my shoes, in my coat of many colours, I hurried off to school, just to find the others laughing and making fun of me in my coat of many colours that my mama had made for me. And oh, I couldn't understand it. I felt that I was rich, and I told them of the love that my mama had sewn in every stitch. And I told them all the story that mama told me as she sewed, of how these beautiful coats of many colours was worth more than all of their clothes. But they didn't understand it, and I tried to make them see that one is only poor if they choose to be. Now I know that we had no money, but I was rich as I could be in my coat of many colours that my mama made just for me. Isn't that beautiful? That is actually a song. So I don't know if any of you know what song that is. If you do, you can pop it in the comments box on the Zoom call. But this is a song that I grew up with, actually. And it's by a country artist called Dolly Parton. And when I was a child and a teen, my mum made us listen to Dolly Parton all the time, which wasn't so cool when we were teenagers. But either way, I grew up with many of her songs, and this was one of them. So it's called My Coat of Many Colours, and it's by Dolly Parton. And I recommend you listen to it because it is just the most beautiful song. What's interesting about this is that it wasn't until my adult life that I realised, a few years ago really, of how sad and powerful that story is, and how in listening to that song, you can immediately transport yourself into the life of a poor 6-year-old country girl in this case in sort of rural America. And I just think it poses a beautiful example of how creativity, a story, a book, a song, can allow us to improve our empathy or drive our empathy or just awaken our empathy, because it is through living that you can create a relationship with that character. So I want to go through 4 tips as to how we can all improve and increase our empathy levels that you can use in work or at home with your family over lockdown, or maybe just during Ramadan. Just some ways that we can be more conscious of how to drive empathy. So my first tip is, unsurprisingly, to read, because the reality is that stories change us, and often for the better, because, as I was saying earlier, we know that stories have been proven, this is scientific and experiments, that reading has been proven to drive empathy up. Now, what's worrying is data has also showed that 43% of graduates out of university never read a book again after they graduate. How depressing is that? It's awful. But anyway, it is what it is. And therefore no longer getting that opportunity to practice empathy, to understanding the realities of others. We also know that 38% of children around the world grow up in households where the TV is on all day. Another stat that I personally cannot imagine. But our children are growing up in a way that they're consuming television much more than they are books. So if we know that reading drives empathy levels up and can allow us and our children to understand each other better, reading is really my first tip. And beyond that data, just to give you a little bit more sort of hard data around that, there was a study done a couple of years ago with, I think it was 10 undergraduate students. And what they did with that experiment was they got the students to read the novel Pompeii, which is by Robert Harris, every night for 11 nights. And as they read the novel and they woke up in the morning, they scanned their brains with an MRI machine. And what they could see in the mornings after they were reading is that increasingly the brain was showing levels of heightened connectivity. So the connections in the brain via a part of the brain called the central sulcus was increasing, was improving. And what happens when the central sulcus is activated or is being used more actively, it means that we're able to use something in our brain called the theory of mind. And what theory of mind means, sorry, this is getting a bit scientific, but it's really important, is that when you have higher theory of mind, you can understand people better. Basically, our empathy goes up. You can understand people's opinions, knowledge, context, scenarios, all those types of things. So what they found in these students was that as they read, the central sulcus was activated more and more. Therefore, they were shown scientifically to be increasing their empathy. So, as I said, the first tip is to read, not just because it's wonderful, but because it does definitely allow us to improve and increase our empathy. The second tip is around practicing live listening, or you can call it empathetic listening. And this comes down to just really hearing people when you listen to them. So how often have you been in a room, a meeting, around the dinner table, when you're listening to everything, you can hear it all, but your brain is totally somewhere else. You're not really hearing. And if someone asks you 3 questions, you probably couldn't answer them. So live listening or empathetic listening is really about being active in hearing people for your benefit, because the more you hear, the more you can understand, the more you can learn about that person, but also for your audience, because people, particularly children, and definitely toddlers and teens, by the way, they have like superpowers in this. They know when you're really listening and when you're not, and they will use it against you, but they will also use it for you, because when people feel heard, they give more. Fundamentally, when we feel heard, we're fulfilling that kind of basic requirements as human beings to be heard, and we give more. People that feel heard give more information, more passion, more content. And just a little tip on this one, if you want to try and listen more actively and you find yourself, your brain's going all over the place, if you take your tongue and put it just behind your top teeth and push your tongue against the roof of your mouth there, next time you're trying to listen to someone, you may find that really helps to clear your mind, of all the other chatter that's going on up there. So yeah, just try that. Put your tongue behind those front teeth and see what that does to your ability when you really want to listen to someone. My third and final tip for today is about not underestimating small gestures, because they definitely matter. And so often they matter more than those kind of big grand gestures ever could. So whether that's making someone a cup of tea, it's writing them a card, it's sending them something, small gestures go a really long way to creating connectivity, to being able to connect to people because they understand that you understand, that you have understood their reality. And as I said, the more you lean in, listen, hear, see people, the more they give you back. So it becomes a very beneficial investment, really. And it always reminds me of a story of this little shoe shine company, which is in Denver and Charlotte airports in the US, and it's called Executive Shine. And it's just one of those small shoe shine businesses where you can go and get your shoes shined up before you go on to your business meeting or wherever you're going next. But Executive Shine has like a tens of thousands people fan base. People love this business. And there's a couple of reasons, and it really talks to these small gestures. So when you sit down at Executive Shine, it's not just a chair and a person, you know, cleaning your shoes. There's all these little signs that say kind of be grateful and love matters and all these beautiful quotes. And when you go to pay, there's no price list. They just ask you to pay what you think it's worth. They also have a beautiful hiring strategy about the type of people. So you really get this amazing conversation. And people just love this business. So much so, I remember reading that one gentleman flew all the way across the country with a suitcase of 49 pairs of shoes to leave with them while he went to his business meeting, just to give them business and help them grow. And I know that the MD, who is Ethiopian, I believe, has since spoken on kind of stages at corporate events and stuff, because they just so beautifully bring to life this idea of doing things from the heart, of putting people first, of empathizing with their audience. And, you know, in a world that is being so reshaped by technology and distance, and particularly now, right, while we're all at home alone, people just have this ever deeper need for sort of authentic humanity and connectivity. So yeah, there's lots of examples of businesses that do this really well, but my third example or tip for today is around small gestures. And on that one, I did actually, somebody showed me just the most beautiful gesture themselves last week, and somebody in Dubai who I don't know, who tunes into my breakfast show, sent me a gift. And he sent me this book, which I wanted to share with you all today. It's called You, Me and Empathy. It's by somebody called Janine Sanders. It's on Amazon. It's a beautiful book. It's for children. It's illustrated, and it's all about how you can teach and train empathy into children. So for those of you that do have children, I promised the person that sent me this that I will keep passing on the gesture he gave me. And it beautifully sums up those tips, because it's about reading, but it's also about small gestures and how that can connect us with total strangers in this case. So I want to finish really just with a couple of final thoughts around why I think empathy is our superpower, really. First of all, as I said at the beginning, empathy is a choice. Empathy is something you can practice, you can be better at, you can choose to use it. And it always reminds me of, there's a very famous Henry Ford quote. So Henry Ford is the guy behind Ford Motors. And he said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're probably right. And what he was referring to is the reality that our brains are plastic and malleable, right? They bend and flex. So if you believe you can do something, you probably can. And if you believe you can't, well, you probably can't. And I think we can put that into practice in all areas of our life, but we can certainly put it to practice in the areas of empathy. And if you do take away from this 32 minutes this morning, a desire to practice more empathy, that would be the quote I would keep in mind, because if you choose to empathize more, you probably can. And if you think that you can't empathize, well, you probably can't. So thank you very much for tuning in. I'm really honoured to be part of the TishTash Sessions agenda and for sharing some of this thinking with you. As I said, I truly have seen the power of empathy in our environments, our schools, that's a chat for another day, and our businesses. I'm very active on LinkedIn, Nimi Micklin. You can find me there. I also have a website, mimimicklin.com, and you can see some of my work there and my upcoming book. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook and all of that stuff. So the ladies at TishTash made me promise to tell you all my handles and connections in case anybody wanted to chat a little bit more or hear a little bit more. And with that, unless there's any questions that pop up in the chat box or the Q&A box right now, I will sign off and say thank you very much for tuning in. I was thrilled to spend my morning with you. And if you do want to hear more, my Empathy for Breakfast show is on Tuesday mornings at 10 a.m. Dubai time, and you can find out more about that online. So thank you very much for having me, and have a really, really lovely day. Bye-bye.